A self-appointed neighborhood enforcer pulled a gun on a teenage boy outside his home, completely unaware that the kid's father was watching, armed and trained by the U.S. Special Forces. Terrence Brooks wasn't looking for trouble. That chapter of his life was behind him. At 42, he had done his time. 2 decades with the U.S. Army Special Forces, countless missions overseas, a chest full of medals he never talked about, and more stories than he'd ever share with anyone except maybe his son, Dorian. He just wanted normal. Grass that needed mowing, a garage with too many boxes, sleep uninterrupted by distant gunfire or tense orders whispered through a radio. That kind of peace. So when he found a modest 3-bedroom home on a tree-lined street in Warner Robins, Georgia, a town quiet enough to forget the noise, he didn't hesitate. It was close enough to Macon for work and school, but far enough for stillness. The house wasn't anything fancy, but it had a good roof, space in the backyard for Dorian to run around, and neighbors who, at least on paper, looked like the kind who kept their lawns neat and their noses out of other people's business. But Terrence should have known. Peace for men like him rarely came that easy. The first few days passed uneventfully. Dorian, only 14 but sharp as a tack, helped unpack boxes and set up their modest home office. His room still smelled like cardboard and new carpet. He was excited. New school, new start, no more moving from base to base. But Terrence noticed it quickly. The way people slowed down when they drove past their house. How a woman walking her golden retriever glanced at them, then crossed the street. How a delivery guy hesitated before knocking, even though the porch light was on. Dorian noticed too. He didn't say anything, just gave his dad a side glance when a pickup truck slowed down again one morning, the driver barely blinking, just staring. It was the same truck they'd seen the day they moved in. Beat-up red Ford, loud engine, American flag bumper sticker, the kind that left more smoke than it should. "Again?" Dorian asked, still brushing crumbs off his hoodie from breakfast. "Same guy," Terrence muttered. "Don't worry about it." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "Should I?" Terrence gave a half smile. "If I start worrying, I'll let you know." But Terrence was already watching. The truck circled back twice that week. Once it stopped completely a few doors down, and the man behind the wheel got out. Lean, white, maybe mid-50s, sunglasses too big for his face, and something holstered under his faded vest. The neighbors barely reacted. In fact, a few waved at him like they knew him. Terrence didn't wave. That weekend, Terrence installed 2 more security cameras, one on the porch, one above the garage. Dorian didn't ask questions. He just handed over the toolbox and grabbed the ladder when his dad needed it. There was no panic, no raised voices, just quiet tension, like something was being built out of dry sticks, waiting for one spark. Later that night, Dorian was brushing his teeth when he asked, "You think they'll ever stop looking at us like that?" Terrence paused before answering. "I think some people need longer to adjust to difference than others. Doesn't mean we stop living. You miss the base? I miss knowing who was watching my back." They didn't say much more. Dorian went to bed. Terrence sat on the edge of his own bed, scrolling through the camera feeds on his phone, watching the street, memorizing the patterns. Nothing obvious, but something was off. The red truck had parked a little too long. The same man walking the same dog at 9:04 every night. No kids playing outside, nobody knocking to say hello. Peace didn't feel like this. Not yet. But Terrence wasn't going to be the one to bring fire to this quiet street. He knew better than that. He'd been trained to wait, to watch, and to act only when there was no other choice. Dean Whitlock didn't need a badge to feel like a cop. He wore one anyway, a shiny, fake HOA security badge clipped to his belt, next to the pistol he carried with 0 training and way too much pride. His job? Nothing. His authority? Non-existent. But ask Dean, and he'd tell you he was the last line of defense in a world falling apart. Dean wasn't appointed by anyone. He appointed himself, said he was protecting community standards, said he was tired of seeing the neighborhood change, said it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. People like Dean always started small, calling in suspicious activity, leaving passive-aggressive notes about trash cans or paint colors. But he escalated. Always did. He'd lived on Carver Way for 19 years, knew everybody's dog, license plate, and how long your guests could stay before he left a warning on your windshield. Most neighbors found him annoying. Some ignored him. But a few? They liked having him around. He said what they wouldn't. So when Dean saw Terence and Dorian move in, something in him tightened. He didn't care about military service, didn't care that Terence kept his lawn trimmed or waved when people walked by. He just saw what he wanted to see. 2 black faces on his street. And he wasn't subtle. Terence had noticed him early. That red truck creeping past wasn't random. Dean always slowed down when Dorian was outside, and when Dorian wasn't, Dean still came by, watching the mailbox, watching the windows. One afternoon, Terence caught him on camera walking up the driveway and pretending to inspect the sidewalk. Dorian had watched it from the living room. What is he even doing? Trying to pretend he owns something. Terence filed a quiet report with the local HOA. They responded a week later with a form letter. Thank you for your feedback. Please note, HOA security is not an active division of our association. In other words, Dean wasn't theirs, but no one was going to stop him either. Terence knew the type. Dean walked like he owned everything he saw, like his opinion carried more weight because it was loud and confident. He didn't recognize boundaries, because no one had ever made him. At the corner store, he introduced himself to Terence like he was reading from a script. You the new guy at 324? Dean asked, blocking the exit. Terence kept it civil. That's right. You get your mailbox approved? Terence raised an eyebrow. Didn't know I needed approval for a box. Well, there's a way things are done around here. We like to keep it looking a certain way. Terence didn't smile. I'm not here to disrupt your view. Dean chuckled, but it had teeth. Just letting you know. We had a lot of turnover lately. Not always the good kind. Terence didn't answer, just walked past him, slow and silent. From that moment on, Dean decided Terence was a problem. Not because of anything Terence had done, but because he hadn't bowed. He hadn't played the part Dean expected. And Dean hated being ignored. A week later, Dorian was outside, fixing the bike chain on his mountain bike near the edge of their driveway. Dean pulled up and stared for a full minute before rolling his window down. You live here? He asked. Flat. Dorian stood up, confused. Yeah? You got proof? Dorian blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Terence stepped outside at that point. Calm but direct. Is there a problem here? Dean smiled like he was doing Terence a favor. Just checking on the neighborhood. You can check from your vehicle, Terence said. Dean opened his mouth, thought better of it, then drove off. Dorian exhaled. What was that? Exactly what it looked like. Why didn't you go off on him? Terence didn't answer right away. Because that's what he wants. That's what people like him count on. Me losing control so he can claim he was right all along. Dorian looked down. That's messed up. Yeah, Terence said. It is, but it wasn't over. Dean had already decided this wasn't about rules or property lines. It was about control, and he wasn't going to stop until someone made him. It was a Thursday afternoon. Warm, clear sky. Dorian had just gotten home from school, dumped his backpack on the porch, and grabbed his bike. He always spent at least an hour riding around the cul-de-sac. Nothing wild, just loops around the block to clear his head. Terence was inside, reheating leftovers and watching the Ring camera feed on his phone like he always did. Not paranoid, just cautious. Force of habit. Dorian pedaled up the street, turned at the corner, and came back down past the vacant house across from theirs. That's when Dean Whitlock's truck rolled around again. Same pickup, same slow crawl. But this time, he didn't just drive by. Dean pulled over, parked directly across from the Brooks driveway, stepped out. And for the first time, he didn't pretend to check mailboxes or look casual. He walked straight toward Dorian. Dorian saw him coming and slowed his bike. Dean's hand rested on his hip, too close to the weapon strapped at his side. You don't live here. Dean said, flat and loud. Dorian squinted at him. I do. No, I don't think you do, Dean said. I've been watching. You've been wandering around other people's property. Dorian put his foot on the ground and stood tall. I haven't stepped off the sidewalk. Dean took another step closer. Sidewalk's part of the community, not just yours to use. Inside the house, Terence dropped his fork. He had already swiped open the camera app. He saw Dean's stance, the way his hand hovered, the way Dorian stiffened. Then Dean pulled the gun, not pointed straight, but angled down, like a threat without words. Terence moved. No panic, no yelling, just fast, efficient movement. He opened the safe near the living room, pulled his own firearm, a legally registered Sig Sauer, standard issue back when he was still active duty. He didn't run, just walked, calm, controlled. By the time he reached the front door, Dean had taken another step toward Dorian. You take one more step with that weapon pointed anywhere near my son, Terence said. And you won't get another one. Dean turned fast. Terence was standing at the edge of the porch, gun not raised but visible. Firm grip, steady voice. Dean opened his mouth like he had something clever to say, but nothing came out. His hand twitched on the pistol. Unclip it. Now, Terence said. Put it down. You've got 3 seconds. Dean didn't move. Terence took one step forward. Not fast, not loud, but with intent. Dean suddenly became very aware of the ring camera mounted above the door, of the neighbors peeking through their blinds, of the silence that had settled over the entire street. He unclipped the gun, placed it on the sidewalk, then raised both hands slowly, like he'd just remembered he wasn't invincible. Terence kept his voice even. Back up. 5 steps. Dean obeyed. 5 clumsy steps back. Sit, Terence said. Dean lowered himself onto the curb, trying to look defiant but failing. His face was red, his shirt stuck to his back. He looked small, outmatched. Terence turned to his son. You good? Dorian nodded, eyes wide but steady. I'm okay. Go inside. But... Go. Dorian walked toward the porch, glancing back twice before disappearing inside. He watched from behind the curtain, fists balled at his sides. Terence stood over Dean and called 911, calmly reported a man pulling a weapon on a minor, gave his name, address, and made it clear everything was being recorded. Dean didn't speak until the police cruiser pulled up 10 minutes later. Even then, he tried to flip the script. He was threatening me, Dean told the responding officers. I was defending myself. The officer looked at Terence. You have camera footage? Front angle, clear audio, Terence replied. Want me to airdrop it to you? They took Dean's weapon. Checked his ID. Turns out he'd been warned before about impersonating HOA authority. No actual charges ever stuck. Until now. The officers took statements. Dean was placed in handcuffs and put in the back of the car. Not aggressively, but firmly. As the cruiser rolled off, one of the younger officers gave Terence a long look. You handled that, differently than most would have. Terence didn't smile. I was trained for worse than this. But what shook Terence most wasn't Dean's gun. It was how many neighbors had watched it happen and stayed silent. The police cruiser hadn't even cleared the street before the neighborhood group chat lit up. Terence wasn't on it, but his next-door neighbor, Tanya Ramsey, was. She texted him screenshots, one message after another. Something's going on at 324. Anyone know why Dean was arrested? That new guy had a gun too, just saying. This is why background checks matter before people move in. Terence didn't respond. He just read every word, hands resting on the kitchen counter. Dorian sat at the table, arms crossed, chewing the edge of his thumbnail. You gonna say something to them? Dorian asked. No? Why not? They're talking like you started it. Let them talk, Terence said quietly. They weren't outside. They didn't see what almost happened. Dorian stood up. Restless. You should have let me say something. I had it under control. You shouldn't have had to. Terence replied, finally meeting his son's eyes. You're 14, Dorian. You don't carry that responsibility, I do. The silence between them wasn't angry, just heavy. That evening, Tanya dropped by with a plate of cornbread and a look of apology. She had lived there 12 years, knew Dean well enough to avoid him, but not well enough to speak up until now. Some of these folks, she said, lowering her voice, they've let him do this stuff for too long. You're not the first family he's gone after. Just the first one who didn't flinch. Terence didn't say much, just thanked her for the food and closed the door. The next day, someone spray-painted "Trouble" on Terence's trash can. Dorian saw it first and grabbed a sponge. I'll clean it. Terence stopped him. Leave it. Why? Because whoever did it wants to see us react. They want us rattled. We won't give them that. It stayed there for 2 more days until the city came and replaced the can. No one admitted to doing it. No one apologized. But the stares continued. At the local hardware store, people whispered when Terence walked past. One man, older in a camo hat, made a point of muttering, "Don't start none. Won't be none," loud enough for Terence to hear. Terence just kept walking. Dorian started keeping a pocket knife in his backpack. When Terence found it, they had their first real fight since moving. "You're not walking around armed," Terence said. "I'm not trying to start anything." "You're trying to survive the wrong way," Terence said, voice rising. "You think carrying a blade makes you safer. You think it gives you power. It doesn't. It gives them an excuse." "So what then?" Dorian snapped. "I'm just supposed to wait for the next Dean?" "You wait with your head up. You wait with your mind sharp. You move with discipline, not fear, not impulse. That's the difference between you walking away or not walking at all." Dorian didn't say anything after that. But he put the knife back in his drawer. The story began to spread outside the neighborhood. Someone had leaked the ring footage anonymously. First on Facebook, then Reddit, then a small local news outlet picked it up. The clip was short, just under a minute. Dean's voice was clear, the gun visible. Terence's calm response. Dorian's stillness. It didn't need commentary. The images said enough. Public reaction split like dry wood. Some comments praised Terence for his restraint. Others asked why he had a gun at all. Some blamed Dean. Others said he was just protecting the community. But the most repeated phrase, "He pulled a gun on a kid, and that kid never even raised his voice." A few days later, Terence received a letter taped to his front door. It wasn't signed, but it read, "You're not welcome here. Leave before something happens you can't fix." He didn't report it. He didn't pack. He stayed. That Sunday, he and Dorian walked together to the small park at the end of the block. Eyes followed them the whole way. No one spoke. Terence nodded at every person he passed. Not forced, just calm, firm. Dorian leaned over and whispered, "You're not scared?" Terence said, "Son, when people look at you with fear in their hearts, they'll do one of 2 things, attack you, or wait for you to mess up. I'm not giving them either." But the message was clear. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about how an entire neighborhood decided who belonged and who didn't. By Monday morning, Dean Whitlock had become a name people whispered, some out of shame, others in quiet support. The local paper finally covered the incident with a dry headline. "Man detained after dispute with teen in Warner Robins neighborhood." It downplayed the weapon. It left out the badge. It failed to mention that the teen had a pistol inches from his chest. Terence wasn't surprised, but someone in the city police department had decided to take it seriously. A detective named Carla Benavides called Terence directly. "Mr. Brooks, I saw the footage. I want to meet." They met the next day at a neutral spot, the public library near Watson Boulevard. Dorian stayed home. Terence came alone. Detective Benavides had tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone. She didn't ask about his military record. She didn't try to impress him. She just sat across the table with a tablet and said, "You showed remarkable restraint. That man had his finger on the trigger. You didn't flinch." "I've seen worse," Terence said. She nodded. "Doesn't make it right." They talked for nearly an hour. about the pattern of complaints against Dean that were never followed through, about the vague connection between Dean and the former HOA president, an old hunting buddy who quietly stepped down last year, about how Dean had somehow convinced some people he was part of the security committee, even though no such thing ever existed. People tolerated him, Benavides said, because it was easier than confronting the discomfort. Terence tilted his head. That's how men like him grow roots, she nodded. Not anymore. Within 2 weeks, Dean was formally charged with brandishing a weapon at a minor, impersonating a public officer, and making terroristic threats. None of the charges were felonies, but they were enough to land him with court dates, legal bills, and a record. The part that really hit him? He was banned from returning to the neighborhood. The same neighborhood he'd policed with swagger now had a trespass notice with his name on it, signed by the city. That shift didn't come easy. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Terence didn't go, but Tanya Ramsey did, and she called him afterward. They tried to smooth it over, she said. Talked about misunderstandings and community values. I told them if a kid had died, they'd be standing in front of cameras apologizing to a grieving father. A few neighbors stopped by in the days that followed. Quiet apologies. Baked goods. One man, a schoolteacher named Leonard Price, shook Terence's hand and said, "You taught this whole block a lesson without saying a damn word." Dorian started walking taller after that. Not proud, just less burdened. He joined a local basketball team, spent afternoons shooting hoops at the park instead of circling the driveway like he was trying not to be seen, and word kept spreading. A local pastor invited Terence to speak at a Sunday service. Not to preach, just to talk. He didn't want to at first, but Dorian said, "Maybe someone else needs to hear it." So he went, stood in front of a packed room at Macedonia Baptist Church and told the story. Not with anger, just facts. Then he said something that stayed with everyone in the room. Control isn't power. Restraint is. A man with a gun can take a life, but a man who holds back when he has every right to act? That's the man who shapes the future. There were no fireworks, no parade, just a slow thaw. A few weeks later, a new rule passed through the HOA board. Anyone seen impersonating security or harassing residents without just cause would be reported directly to law enforcement. No HOA approval needed. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Terence stood on his porch one evening, arms crossed, watching Dorian walk back from practice. Hoodie up, earbuds in, unbothered. Tanya called out from her yard, "Your boy's got some speed." Terence smirked. "He gets it from his mom." Dorian laughed when he heard that. But even with Dean gone and policies changed, Terence knew this wasn't the end. It was just the first time someone made the neighborhood look at itself. The calls slowed down, the stares faded. The garbage can was no longer defaced, and the neighborhood group chat, so lively during the chaos, quieted into birthday announcements and dog-sitting requests. Life, it seemed, had moved on. But Terence Brooks hadn't. Not completely. You don't forget the image of your son standing still while a stranger decides whether or not to squeeze a trigger. He'd seen a lot in his time overseas. Bombs buried in sand, doors kicked open in silence, decisions made in fractions of a second. But nothing hit like that afternoon on his own street. One evening, Dorian came into the living room holding a permission slip. "They want me to give a talk," he said. "At school. About the incident." Terence looked up from the newspaper. "What for?" "They're doing some anti-bullying, community awareness thing. Mrs. Carver said my story might help." Terence thought for a moment. "You want to do it?" Dorian shrugged. "I'm not scared of talking. Just don't know what to say." "Say what you know," Terence said. "Not what they expect to hear." Dorian stared at the paper a bit longer, then nodded. 2 weeks later, Terence sat in the back of the school gym while Dorian stood under fluorescent lights in front of 200 students. No microphone, just his voice. "He pulled a gun on me," Dorian said plainly. "He said I didn't belong, but I was on my own street. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stood there. My dad stepped in before it got worse." He paused, scanning the crowd. Some kids leaned forward. A few teachers wiped their eyes. I think a lot of us get looked at like we don't belong. Not just me. Maybe because of how we dress, where we come from, how we speak. But we do. We belong in our homes, in our schools, on our sidewalks. That sentence hung in the air. Afterward, kids came up to shake his hand. Some asked him questions. A few just stood quietly, unsure of what to say, but they felt it. Terence waited until they got in the car to speak. "You handled yourself like a man today." Dorian smiled faintly. "Didn't feel like one that day." Real strength isn't about how you feel in the moment. It's about what you choose not to do, even when everything inside you says, swing. That night, Terence sat at his desk with a legal pad. He wrote out a list of principles he used to teach new recruits. Calm under fire, eyes on the exit, never assume the room is safe. He crossed out the jargon, rewrote them for Dorian. Then he stuck the list to the fridge. It wasn't long after that. The city council invited him to speak. They were updating community engagement policies and wanted input. Terence didn't dress in anything fancy, just a button-down and jeans. He didn't bring statistics or slides, just his presence. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up to the mic and said, "I don't need to be protected from my own son. I need to know he won't be treated like a threat before he even speaks." A few heads nodded. A few didn't move at all. That didn't matter. He continued. "Some people think safety means making everyone who looks different feel watched. That's not safety. That's fear with a badge." After the meeting, a council member approached him and said, "You changed a lot of minds tonight." Terence didn't answer with thanks. Just said, "Let's hope they stay changed when the next kid is standing on the sidewalk." At home, Dorian was stretched across the couch, shoes off, watching an old kung fu movie with the sound too loud. Terence stood at the doorway, arms crossed, quiet. Dorian looked over. "What?" "Nothing," Terence said. "You're all right. You want me to turn it down?" "No, leave it." He walked to the kitchen, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat at the table. For the first time in weeks, his hands didn't feel tight. Outside, the porch light flicked on as motion sensors caught a squirrel or a breeze. Nothing urgent, nothing threatening, just light doing its job. But even with the peace settling in, Terence knew it came with a cost, one they'd both carry in ways the neighborhood would never fully see. It had been nearly 3 months since Dean Whitlock stood on the curb in handcuffs, red-faced and silent. In that time, Terence and Dorian settled into something close to normal. The lawn was always cut by Saturday afternoon. Trash bins lined the curb like clockwork. Neighbors waved a little more than before, some out of courtesy, some out of guilt. Dorian had grown taller. His voice was deeper, more sure. The way he carried himself had changed too. He still smiled, still joked. But there was something underneath it now, an awareness. Terence watched it quietly. There were moments, brief, quiet ones, when he'd catch Dorian staring too long out the front window, or pausing just a beat before stepping off the porch. It passed quickly, but Terence saw it. That imprint, the kind people carry even when the wound isn't bleeding anymore. One Saturday morning, they were in the garage organizing old gear. Dorian held up one of Terence's field packs. "You used to carry this every day?" Terence nodded. "Back when I had to. It's heavy." "It was supposed to be." Dorian slung it over his shoulders, wobbling a bit. "I couldn't run a mile in this." "You don't need to," Terence said. "You're not fighting my wars." "But sometimes it feels like I'm still in one," Dorian muttered, almost to himself. Terence paused, then looked him square in the eyes. "You are. It's just a different kind." Later that afternoon, they sat out on the porch, both drinking lemonade, the sky bruised with late sun. An older couple walking their dog waved. Terence waved back. Dorian gave a nod. Then Dorian said, "Do you think Dean ever really thought I was a threat?" Terence didn't answer right away. "I think Dean didn't care what was true. He cared about what made him feel in control. You were standing in the way of that. That's all it took. Dorian sat back, legs stretched, and he still didn't say sorry. People like that rarely do, Terence said. So why didn't you do more? Dorian asked. Like, really go after him? Terence turned to him. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about exposure. Dean's gone. His lies are public. People know what he did. And you're still here. Dorian thought about that. Feels like a small win. It always starts small. Then it grows. That evening, Terence typed something on his phone while sitting at the kitchen table. A post for a neighborhood forum he'd never used before. To those who watched and said nothing, silence isn't neutral. To those who stood up after it happened, thank you. To the ones still unsure where they stand, ask yourself what you'd do if it had been your child on that sidewalk. He didn't send it. Instead, he called Dorian into the kitchen and read it aloud. Dorian smiled. That's good, Terence said. I think I'll let the living speak louder than the words. Dorian nodded. That's what you've been doing. There was no perfect ending to the story, no big ceremony, no viral redemption arc. But the porch stayed quiet. Dorian went to school each morning without checking both sides of the street. He stopped glancing at the ring notifications on his dad's phone. He slept deeper, laughed louder, and Terence, he stopped keeping his pistol near the front door. He moved it back to the bedroom safe, where it belonged. Not because he didn't believe it might be needed again, but because he believed, for the first time in a long time, that maybe it wouldn't. In the end, they had claimed more than a house, more than a patch of land on a Georgia street. They'd claimed space, dignity, the right to exist without fear. And that, Terence thought, was worth more than any headline or court ruling. Because the real victory isn't surviving the fire. It's staying human through it. If this story meant something to you, share it. Let others hear it. Let the silence break. And if you're not already subscribed, stick around. These stories matter.